everyone. Welcome to Live from the Heartland. I'm Thom Clark, talking to you on what is an unseasonably fall week that we've just had, which has affected the harvest a little bit. As you know, we're trying to start with a local farm report every week. Our chickens are still hatching their eggs very well in our backyard, although this cold, rainy weather kind of threw them off. They spent a lot more time inside their coop rather than out in the yard. I have a special report from the owner of the Heartland Cafe, and you ought to stop by the general store, which has a whole bunch of new local produce and products, if you haven't seen it recently, at the corner of Glenwood and London Rogers Park. Tom reports that the Paula Reds are picked in the cooler, and they're just starting to pick Empire apples. The Empire is an apple, he points out, that's kind of a cross between Macintosh and Red Delicious. It's kind of a great pie, but also eating apple. Honeycrisps are almost ready, and this is the week of the peak tomato harvest, although I suspect the cold weather held that one off again. I know in my own backyard in Rogers Park, we got lots of green tomatoes that need at least a week or two of hot weather before they're going to ripen up. And of course, winter squash is just around the corner, and they're beginning to let them cure and move into the market, as well as the general store at the restaurant. The store is seeing the shift of the season. Tom reports the summer squash and beans are making their way for the fall cascade of apples and winter squash, and probably you'll begin to see that on the menu as well. And finally, if you ever in the Berrien Springs area of Michigan, as I was for a family wedding last weekend, U-pick season is opening up, not only at Prairie First Farms, but many other farms in and around southwestern Michigan, as well as around our region. So this morning, we're going to talk mayoral politics. And a little bit later, we're going to talk with an investigative reporter about Chicago parks and probably a little bit about public housing. But I want to welcome to the program one of the people who's taken on challenging Mayor Rahm Emanuel this coming mayoral campaign season. Welcome to the show, Amara Enyia. Thank you so much for coming. So I have to start with the basic question: why do you want to take on Mayor Emanuel?
Well, it's a sense of responsibility. We are, I think, at an historic moment as a city, and the issues that we face are quite urgent, and I think it requires new leadership with new ideas and new energy. I see it every day. I live in the East Garfield Park community, so a lot of the challenges that we see and experience I face them every single day, and so I think that we have to really stand up and take leadership positions in this city. I think this is our opportunity to do so.
We are hearing a lot about some challenges to the mayor. The Chicago Teachers Union President Karen Lewis pops up about every other day with a little fundraiser here and a little meet and greet there. A little bit later this morning, a second ward alderman is going to announce for mayor. You announced back in the spring and officially in June. Why haven't we heard more about you?
Well, we've been on the ground doing the work, getting out into the neighborhood. So we've been doing meet and greets on our Unity Tour, which is this campaign getting into all of the communities and meeting with community groups, meeting with organizations, meeting with average residents. So we've been touring around the city for months now, just spreading our word and spreading our message, understanding that it's necessary to get the word out as a candidate that seemingly came out of nowhere.
So I could describe your background generally as someone who consults with small, mid-sized towns. You've worked for the Austin Chamber of Commerce on the west side of Chicago. But tell our listeners a little bit more about your background, why you think you have the tools and the perspective to run a major city like Chicago.
Well, we need leadership that is well-rounded, especially on policy. Someone that understands municipal finance equally as education, someone that understands public safety, that understands economic development, workforce development, and that's what I bring to the table. So my background is, I have a PhD in education policy, so that's what I specialized in. I also have a law degree and a master's in education. I spent time working in City Hall specifically to get an understanding of how cities work, how the departments interface with each other, and who's making decisions and how those decisions are being made. So I spent time in City Hall. I also have experience at the grassroots level. So I was the executive director of a nonprofit. I've worked with community-based organizations all around the city. And of course, I do municipal consulting. That's my profession. So working with small, mid-sized cities, helping them across policy areas. So I think the city needs someone with well-rounded experience that understands not just the top levels of city government, but also understands the grassroots level and what the experience is for average Chicagoans.
So I think that's a background a lot of our listeners alive the Heartland would appreciate, but I'm not sure how LaSalle Street would react to what might come across as another pointy-headed intellectual. I don't mean to be that in a disparaging way, but that's the way this kind of game of politics gets played. How do you offset the lack of actually elected governing experience when you're talking with folks?
Well, it's really understanding what's in the best interest of the city. And so, referencing LaSalle Street, it's really understanding what the needs are also of the business community. And so, someone who works with small businesses every single day, I'm very sensitive to and aware of those issues, similar to what the needs are of our corporate partners. And I say corporate partners because they have a role to play in our economic ecosystem as well. And so I think that that people are looking for leadership that they can identify with and that is able to build bridges across difference, understanding that we have a collective interest in working together for this city. So we need someone who's a uniter, someone who's not going to polarize or pit different groups against the other. And that's what I represent, and I think that's why even the business community would be receptive to what my administration could look like.
There are many people who feel that Toni Preckwinkle would have been the strongest challenger to Mayor Emanuel. My guess is that she has enough to do with county government, and why take on the former Mayor Daley's problems that Rahm's trying to fix? Why do you want to take on what really is our plethora of problems? I mean, the city is broke, if I can be blunt about it, put a little edge on it for a moment. What would you do about resolving a really imbalanced budget that keeps using tricks, and more particularly the pension crisis?
Well, the reason why I want to take on this challenge is because I think we need new ideas and new leadership with new energy to tackle these problems. I think that that's what's required if we're really going to go in another direction. As far as the city's finances, I think what needs to happen is taking a long-term view about what's in the city's best interest from a fiscal standpoint. That means we need long-range planning. What the practice has been with the current administration has been to paper over our debts, increasing borrowing every single year, and then drawing down on our corporate reserves, which is not sustainable. We need to be creative in identifying recurring sources of revenue, as opposed to the non-recurring sources that we've been really relying on, which is fines and fees and permits and all of these expenses that more predominantly impact low-income and middle-income residents. And we know that that's not sustainable for our city. That's not how you grow the economy. And so I think that new energy and new ideas is required to really make the difficult decisions that will set us on the right track long-term. And that's what I represent.
How do you feel about the transaction tax that some other candidates are proposing as one way to bridge the gap on revenue?
It has to be on the table. I'm a very strong supporter of looking at a financial transaction tax because I think that it is the only tax, at least right now, that is able to bring in the amount of revenue that can sustain the city. So again, we have to have the will to even put this on the table because we know that what we're currently doing is not sustainable. And so for that reason, the financial transaction tax, along with reallocating our priorities as a city, how do we allocate finances in a way that's equitable and in a way that makes sure that we're not unduly burdening our low-income and middle-income residents? So I think we have to have a creative mix of ideas that can really address our long-term fiscal issues.
You're listening to Amara Enyia, who's a mayoral candidate in the city of Chicago, on Live from the Heartland. Let's dig a little bit more into this monetary issue. And in particular, I want to talk about TIFs. Tax increment financing districts, supposedly $1.6 billion just kind of sitting there. These are diverted property taxes that could be going to schools, pensions, things like that. Every mayor seems to love TIFs as their own kind of personal slush fund. Do you think you would use it any differently
I think
if you were successful?
I would use TIFs for the reason which they were created, which is to spur economic development, particularly in blighted areas. Unfortunately, the way TIFs have been used, they have not really served a lot of the communities that can actually benefit from those dollars, and that's because of the practice called porting, where we actually port TIF dollars from one part of the city to another if those TIFs are contiguous, meaning if they're touching. And so a TIF in Austin might not actually use those dollars because perhaps we've ported them to downtown for some development project or some other endeavor that the mayor is supporting. I think we need increased accountability with how TIF dollars are used. We also need increased transparency. That means making sure that the public is aware who's getting those dollars, how they're used, how those decisions are being made, and who's benefiting. That information right now, it's very difficult to come by. There's a community activist named Tom Tresser who's launched the TIF Illumination Project and went around the city gathering community groups to show them this is how your dollars are being used. And what was found was very surprising. It really revealed the inequitable use of those TIF funds across the city. And at the same time, we're staring at school closings, we're staring at decreased or degraded services where those dollars could be used for infrastructure in neighborhoods that really need the funds. So in my opinion, it's reform. It means a complete overhaul in how TIFs are used, but we have to have the political will to do that.
Probably one of the biggest reasons why the incumbent is facing challengers is the way he's handled the school issue. What would you have done differently with a system that is also broke, that has tremendous demands on both the kind of teaching and the kind of services schools as community centers end up providing, but it's another system that's broke and also has a huge overriding pension crisis, which actually wasn't there 5 or 10 years ago. I'm sorry, that's a five-part question already, but tell us about your plan for Chicago Public Schools and what you would do differently than the current mayor.
The first step is to put the public school system in the hands of education professionals who are willing to work with the community to meet their needs. We need education professionals in our schools. Right now we have a business model that's sort of operating our school district. So I think having education professionals who actually understand what good education policy and practice is, they need to be in leadership. I propose a freeze on charter schools because right now we've moved in this direction of creating a dual education system. We have a responsibility to provide quality education to all of our students, not just some, not just those that are able to get into charter schools or other schools. That should be our top priority, and so that means we have to fully fund our public neighborhood schools. Supporting teachers and curriculum that is well-rounded, not curriculum that creates good test takers. This is a huge issue. How do we ensure that we have a curriculum that includes the arts, that includes vocational education? Because I believe that students should have options when they graduate. They should be able to be employed, go to college, or both if they want. And so how do we make sure that that happens? And of course, the last piece is an elected school board, because we need a dose of democracy in our school system. That's what a lot of the frustration, and for me even, is working on the school closing issue, was that people felt that they were not heard. We gathered, we had meetings for a year, and at the end of all of that work, we were told again that our schools were simply going to be closed. And so an elected school board is one way of injecting that dose of democracy into our school system. Those are the top things that we need to do immediately. And the other point is just honesty. Honesty in how we handle the difficult issues that we face. A lot of us were led to believe that our schools were closed for one reason, but then it came out later that they were being closed for 5 different reasons. Or when we hear that some of the schools in our neighborhoods, we couldn't afford toilet tissue for the kids. But then we can identify tens of millions of dollars to build another selective enrollment high school on the near north side. It sends mixed messages about what's the real motivation behind the actions that the school system is taking. And so that's very problematic. And so having that baseline of good faith and fair dealing in government, I think, is largely underestimated and underappreciated, but it goes far in helping us to collectively make the difficult decisions that we know need to be made.
So how do you think you would achieve those laudable goals in turning around public education without some kind of revenue increase, meaning property taxes?
Well, the first step is a reallocation of our funds, which means a reallocation of our priorities. So we have to prioritize our public neighborhood schools because that is our responsibility as a municipality and as a public school system. And so what that means is, instead of diverting funds to schools that are doing okay, this notion of equity is important. It means that regardless of where a child lives, they should have access to a high quality education. And so equity means that in those areas where schools are really struggling, where they're lacking funds, they're lacking books, they're having to cut teachers, and so on and so forth, you actually have to devote more funds to those areas. And so I brought up the example of when they were proposing this new selective enrollment high school. Well, how is it that we can identify tens of millions of dollars for that project, but we still have schools perhaps on the far south side or on the southwest side that the teachers had to be fired or the counselor had to be laid off because of severe budget cuts? The other issue is this notion of the turnaround school. So there was a school in Lawndale, Dvorak School, that was converted to a turnaround school. And after the teachers were all laid off, there was an infusion of, I believe, maybe $2.5 million. Why is it that after the turnaround took place, now that school gets the additional funding that it needs? I believe that the current staff would have loved to have an infusion of a couple $1 million to help them do what they do. And so again, this is about our priorities, and it's about how do we equitably allocate funds to make sure that all of our schools are high quality and our kids have an opportunity to get access to a good education regardless of where they live.
Amara Enyia, candidate for mayor, your personal story is pretty interesting. Your family's journey here. Could you talk to our listeners a little bit about how you ended up in Chicago?
Well, my story starts with my parents. So my parents were activists. So I sort of come from a line of activists. My parents are Nigerian immigrants. And so my dad fought in our Civil War. There was a civil war in Nigeria in 1967. And my mother was a frontline nurse in that war. And so my dad was 21 when he decided to fight in that war. At the time, a genocide was taking place against our ethnic group. And so later on, when I asked him why at 21, which is the prime of life for a young man, why he would willingly risk his life to fight in that war, and they were fighting against Nigeria. Nigeria was supported by the UK, by all of these superpowers. He said that it wasn't the fact necessarily that our people were being killed. He said it's that he just can't stand oppression. And so it's these principles of social justice and of equity and of holding governments accountable for what they do, that's how we were raised. So I have 5 siblings. We were always raised in that way. And so even after the war ended, he and my mom continued to work against the government. So there were a number of dictators in Nigeria after the war, and they moved to the United States and continued their activism, where they could easily have said, we're a world away, let's forget it, raise our kids here, and move on with life. They continued their activism here in Chicago. So they were organizing on the north side. I spent most of my time growing up on the north side, in the Rogers Park area, uptown area, where there's a large African immigrant population. And so they were organizing the community in Chicago against the government, holding press conferences. Every single weekend we were at another press conference or another meeting. And it was actually quite dangerous. In 1997, the government executed 7 dissidents. And for a while we weren't able to go back to Nigeria because of the political climate. They actually were even sending people to our home here. And at the time, my parents, they said, we thought that they were their friends, but it wasn't until later when we were older that they said that they were actually emissaries from the government that had been there to intimidate them. And so for us, it's about a sense of responsibility to these notions of social justice and fighting back against corrupt governments and believing that people actually have power to transform systems. And so for me, growing up in that context with parents who lived that, and then living in Chicago and seeing all the issues that we're facing and knowing that drastic change needs to happen, there was no doubt that running for mayor just seemed like the necessary thing to do. And so that's what I'm doing.
You're listening to Live from the Heartland on WLUW 88.7 FM and also online at WLUW.org. We've been talking with Amara Enyia, who's candidate for mayor of the city of Chicago. And I guess I want to end on this note. There was a young organizer working on the South Side who went off to law school and came back, and I was trying to recruit him for our board of directors for our young nonprofit. And we got to know Barack Obama pretty well that way. And then his book came out, and my business partner wrote a story in the Reader about this bright, intelligent young man. Why do you want to get into politics? You're such a nice, talented person. So I ask you the same question, Amara.
We have to. I think that we need more people who are motivated by the right principles in leadership. I think politics and being an elected official is about service. And I think that for too long we've ceded the political arena to individuals who really don't have the best interests of the public at heart. And so for me, it's if we have the talent, if we have the skills, and we have the passion and the desire to do it and the right motivation, I think that we should, because we can actually change the direction that we're moving in. I think we have the ability to really make some significant changes. And I think historically, I can't say that I always wanted to be a politician. In fact, because of my experience and my parents' experience, it wasn't my first career choice. But this is bigger than me. I think it's bigger than any one individual. And I think it's about how can I be useful in improving the lives of other people. and however I can maximize every skill, every degree, every talent that I have to help improve the lives of others. And this happens to be the arena at this point in my life where I believe I can do that.
Are you starting petition passing?
We have already started. We are in every community. We've got volunteers on the ground. They'll be out in Humboldt Park today. They'll be out on the far south side. They'll be out on the north side today collecting signatures to get me on the ballot.
And money?
Fundraising all the time. That's the big thing.
But
right
how's
now.
it going?
It's going well. I think now that people actually believe that I'm going to go through with it, they've started giving. I think there was some curiosity as to whether I was actually going to move forward initially for the first few months. And now that I'm still here, still on the ground, still organizing, people are starting to say, okay, well, maybe we can actually donate.
So you're not quite a brand name yet, although I had no problem following you all around the web. How can people find out more about your campaign or get an opportunity to volunteer if they wish?
Well, we are online at www.amaraforchicago.com. That's AMARAFOR Chicago.com. We are also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and every other social media medium at Amara for Chicago. And you can send an email, amaraforchicago@gmail.com. We're online and very accessible.
We really appreciate you joining us on Life in the Heartland this morning and wish you the best of luck in your campaign. I think the more the merrier whenever we get around to electoral season, so congratulations for putting your foot into the ring and good luck.
Thank you very much.
You're listening to Live from the Heartland on WLUW 88.7 FM. I'm Thom Clark, one of the co-hosts. Michael is off in Cape Town this week, and Katie is helping to do voter registration and turnout for the governor. And we're all very busy in this Saturday morning as we hope